I could not agree more with that. Very well said. Relationship it outweighs the whole point of this podcast. Data driven negotiations. The data is meaningless if you have no relationship on the other side of the table. Unfortunately, at CIR, we see a lot of times where something could be settled if not for a strained relationship in an area. So that devalues everything. No reason to get data, guys. Go out there, build the relationship first. So podcast over. Like, we're not even going to talk data until you have a good relationship with your business managers. Who cares what's going on across the country? We care about what's happening in our city and in our backyard. So, Katie, you've been quiet for a while, and I don't want you to lose your voice, so we're going to have you answer this one. And since also I'm calling you out because you're the one that doesn't use the national data as much, you rely more on local data. So let's talk about that. What local data do you use? How do you use it? How do you present it?
I think one of the most important things that we look at is our market share. So we negotiate 3-year contracts and we look at it over all 3 years. As much as it is presenting data to the union to get them on board, there's also an aspect that it's presenting things to your management team for them to be on board with that data as well. Because they will often, especially if the market share shows high, disagree with that. And you want to make sure that you guys are all on the same page there. So we'll look at market share, and then we'll look at man hours and how they have been trending both throughout the contract cycle and then also over time. You'll have polarizing opinions on this is the worst market we've ever seen, or this is the best market we've ever seen. And quite frankly, both of those are generally incorrect statements. And so you really look at, compared to other times, here, this is where we're at. So those are the two largest pieces of data I'll say that we use locally in trying to determine where we're at. And then we'll look at which other areas near us are similar, and then see if they've had any recent settlements or what their markets are doing, just to get an idea of where we might want to be. We don't use that as gospel.
You said you looked at surrounding areas. Do you mean surrounding electrical unions, or do you also look at other trades?
So we look at surrounding electrical. It's not just surrounding as in geographically they are near us. We're in the southern region. And so in our district, who else has a 6% market share? If we just look geographically, even my own two locals, one is 6% and one is 26%. They have a very different union presence. They have very different bargaining ability, and understanding that is important, especially because some of those contractors work within both areas, and for them to be able to differentiate what's happening in each of those markets is important.
Geographic comparison is not always the best comparison, because just like you said, two cities may be 40 minutes apart from each other, but their economies can be daylight and dark. But you can look 2 states over and find a city that's much closer to yours, has a similar economy, and paints a much better picture, at least as far as a comparison goes, of where you should be settling. So very good point. Definitely, if you're taking notes, write that one down. Luke, local data, what do you use?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Katie's doing. In our jurisdiction, St. Paul and Minneapolis are very close together. We are the same market, basically. So one of us settles, it doesn't settle the other one, but it kind of sets the bar for the other jurisdiction. We, very rarely have ever had any differentiation in total packages between the two jurisdictions. So yeah, we look at that information. I'm definitely looking at all of the other building trades. That can be a huge driver. I'm lucky in my jurisdiction, there is a consulting group that negotiates some of the other trade settlements and prepares a collection of all of the data. So I can scattergram all of the building trades settlements in our jurisdiction for the last 10 years. I can trend it. I can see whether we're above trend, below trend. I can pull out, like I said, iron workers, pipe fitters, plumbers, sheet metal, sprinkler fitters, and then compare that to electricians in our jurisdiction. They're highly predictive of what's going to happen because those top 5 building, top, have the biggest total package. Those 3 or 5 track very closely together and have over a long period of time.
All right. Well, Mike, what kind of local data did you use?
From a local data standpoint, I leaned heavily on the trust funds. And the reason I say that is because in addition to the volatility and the changes in the market, you also have outside pressures that has a direct impact on our competitive position again. Health and welfare, you look at those and you see the trends, even though you may be able to adjust or account for increases over here for money in the pocket is, sometimes there's increases on these settlements that are thrust upon you that are out of your control, but you need to be cognizant of that going into negotiations, especially with the defined benefit pension plans. There's an uncertain level of uncertainty there. The health and welfare trends continue to all-time high. Other than that, like I said, from a local standpoint, those are just things that I really heavily relied on and try to project.
Awesome. All right, Jason, what do you guys do locally?
So number one, I concur with everything everyone said, and it's more of just elaborating and piggybacking a little bit. To Mike's point, one of the big things, I think that's key. The trust funds are a big part of what we do. But the other thing that I look at, since traditionally most locals do allocate the money the way they want to, I track how much of the raise actually went to wages versus what went to funds. And there's a difference of mandatory health insurance increases and maybe things that we need to put into pension to keep funding liability up, things of that nature, versus what they're putting into an HRA, MRA account, or what they're putting into a DC plan. So, I love it when they say, our guys need a raise, and then 5 cents or 10 cents of the raise go on the check, and all the rest of it went to benefits. And most of that didn't need to go there. So I tracked what actually went to wages very closely because of that. I think the other big one that I would say is on the geographical stuff. We're seeing a lot of these large projects come up, the Amazons and the Googles and things like that. And I think that it's not a driving force of what you should settle on, but it's definitely something you need to be aware of, that when there's a big project next door, maybe you don't have the same metropolitan setup and things of that nature. But if you're not keeping your wages in somewhat of the same ballpark, no one's going to be in your area working. And manpower is such a premium these days that I don't think that you give the farm up because of that, but you need to be aware of it and recognize that that's going to determine your ability to maintain your manpower in your market when there's large increases in those areas next to you.
Well said. That's a good one. I see Mike raising his hand and Chuck raising his hand. Mike, are you deferring to Chuck? Okay, Chuck, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Jason sounded like so many of the business managers we hear at CIR. We have to raise the wages because nobody will work here if we don't. That's an ongoing battle, and it's a real battle. When somebody's got a lot of work next door or within a reasonable drive, you're competing not just in your local market, but with the people in the other area. It's one of the most difficult things you have to bargain over.
And that's a good point to raise, Chuck, because if you are coming to council, you need to be prepared to defend that point. The local is going to raise that point that City B got 5%. So if we don't get at least 5%, all of our membership's just going to go work over there because it's only a 45-minute drive. I'm going to pause for a second and write that down because that's a bonus material. I want us all to maybe weigh in on that before we end of what you think is a good argument for that particular scenario. And then we're going to move on to some final questions here. I do see you, Jason. We're going to move on to some final questions here. We'll wrap up with that one, and then I can let you guys get to your Friday because I've taken up a lot of your time now. Okay, I got it. Jason, what you got?
Just one other local data thing. I think, those of you that know me, I've got a heavy background with the JETC, and I know it's kind of always split between JETC and labor management. But one thing I will say that I think is important to track locally is JETC apprenticeship rates in the other building trades, because of the fact of recruiting and things of that nature. So when you get to the negotiations and you're talking about percentages for pay rates and raises for apprentices, it's nice. You don't want to have the lowest pay rate out there and people aren't looking at your program because of that. So it's good to be aware of what those other building trades are paying for their apprenticeships throughout the time during the apprenticeship, wage and package, so you can make an informed decision on where your percentages need to be at.
That's a very good statement, because a lot of times we bargain based off of the journeyman rate. While that's very important to your contractors for their crew costs, that's also, like Jason said, is very impactful on the cost of your recruitment. If your apprentices aren't making more than they can go make at a lot of our customers, Amazon, Intel, all them, to go work in a warehouse, it's going to be very hard to fill those positions. Let's move on to some questions that don't fit really anywhere on here that I wrote down as we were going through. But since we've been talking about data, I want each of you to spend just a few seconds saying how you legitimize your data, how you make it approachable but believable. Katie.
That is in part why I use NECA IBEW data as often as possible, because there is a portion of that legitimizes it for really both sides of the table. And you default to the idea, or you allude to the idea, that that's where CIR will look also. Also, I'm stating this as a chapter who has not been to CIR in like 20 years. So this seems to work just fine.
It's not a bad thing.
Just the threat of CIR. There's also a sense that we just go ahead and accept that whatever we use is going to have some fallibility to it. So we all just agree that this is the one that we're going to use. And to everyone else's point that they've been making, is when you do it over and over again and use that same data over and over again, you're still trending with the same good or bad information.
Awesome. So you not only let the data legitimize itself, but the fact that you're using industry numbers as well as using the same numbers over and over, but you also go into it with the understanding that it's not always going to be right, but it's the best you have. Would you say that?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Evans.
The only thing I could say is preparation, education. Whatever data you collect and you compile, if you, again, it goes back to the point of be forthcoming with the other side. Whatever data you, in the conversations you have with your side of the table, you have the same conversation in the same context on the other side of the table. Because if the other side doesn't understand what you're talking about, you might as well speak in a foreign language. So hopefully that makes sense what I'm trying to say.
It does. You have to make sure that the data you're presenting is understood by both parties. Just throwing numbers at them means nothing. It's just a number. But if they understand where it comes from and what it means, that is how you're legitimizing your data. Who is it going to be? All right, Jason, go.
Those of you that know me, I've got to talk to everyone on this call at length at a lot of things, facts and figures are forgotten and stories are retold. When you have information that's actually affected people that they can actually relate to and understand, it makes it a lot more realistic and believable. And it's not about making something up. It's about pulling that information out of the people that it's actually affected to help you do what's best for the industry to make a good negotiation. I joke around every negotiation. I always say, I want to pay all of you guys $100 an hour because my contractors make money off of what we pay you. But I want you to work too, and you can't work at $100 an hour. So I think it's really good to try to make it personal as you can and find those stories that make people understand that data realistically.
So to summarize Jason there, make your data tell a story. And that's what's going to legitimize it. That's what's going to make it impactful. A steak dinner served on a trash can lid is not that appetizing. You know it's coming to you, buddy. Luke, how do you legitimize your data?
I would piggyback off what Jason said because he's exactly right. You need to build a narrative of what's happening in your jurisdiction. And you need to do that with both your contractors and the union. Every time I talk to a contractor, I'm saying, well, this is what I'm seeing. This is my elevator speech of what I think is happening in my jurisdiction right now. Do you see that? And then I get more feedback on that. And then when I talk to my business manager, I say, oh, well, this is what I'm thinking about the industry today, and I see where he's pushing back. And then when I get the data, and I'm not talking about just during negotiations, I'm talking anytime. When I get data that backs up my narrative for what's happening in the industry, I use that data at that time and lay it out on the table. I don't wait until negotiations. That data happens right then and there. That I build credibility that I know what's going on in the industry. I'm not an electrical contractor. I shouldn't know. It's not my day-to-day business. But I know what's happening in the industry. I have a story to tell about that industry. And every time I talk to that business manager, every time I talk to a contractor, I try to glean another story and drop in more data and facts and figures that back up what I'm trying to say.
So to summarize that, not only are you saying what Jason's saying, you have to build that narrative, you have to build the story, but for you, it's constant communication and no surprises. So that by the time you get to bargaining, you're not telling them stuff they don't already know. They've been hearing this for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and this is not new information now. Your data is legitimate because it was real time and given in that moment. And now all you're doing in bargaining is saying, I've already told you this, so this is where we are. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Luke. Mike, I saw your hand up. Go for it, man.
It goes back to the old adage that we always say, when do we start negotiations? The moment that we settle our last contract.
Truer words have not been spoken. But speaking of true words, Mr. Kelly, speaking to legitimizing data, maybe could you talk about some ways you could see data or being able to legitimize data and make it more believable, not only to both sides, and talk about the importance of it from a national level, how you've seen it been used correctly, data used correctly, and also maybe an instance where you've seen it incorrectly applied.
I'm going to get back to things that Jason and Mike have already said, but as I've said in many presentations, we fall into the trap of management argues statistics and the union argues philosophy. And that's not mine. I got that from somebody else, but it's true. The union is all about its members, at least when it's in its bargaining posture. So Jason said, you got to tell a story. Let people remember the story, not the facts. And that's true. How does this affect the individual worker? You want to legitimize your information, you need to be able to explain it, not in a condescending way. Just lay it out there, tell them what you think it means, why you think it means that, and invite them to participate in that information.
Well, I am definitely over the amount of time I asked you guys to commit to this, and I apologize for that, for one thing. But I cannot say thank you enough. I have not forgotten about my last question, and I hope you guys have prepared your briefs and are ready to present. But I do want to just put a bow on all of our discussions about data and in negotiations, because I've had this said to me before, that numbers aren't everything, because I am a numbers-driven person, that at the end of the day, we are talking about people, and we are talking about people's livelihoods, and that's what you're doing when you're bargaining. The numbers are a good starting point. They're a good place to set the stage, but they're not going to be the final. They're not going to be the whole story. That's what you can take from this about utilizing data in negotiations, that they provide you a foundation, they provide you a benchmark, but they're not going to get you all the way there. There's other skills and other tactics and other means of bargaining that's going to tell the whole story, that's going to get you from that opening letter to that final handshake. Thank you guys for that. We'll wrap up here shortly, but now the council is in session, and the next case before us is the local has said that the neighboring city got 4%. And if we don't get at least 4%, all of our manpower gone tomorrow. Luke, what do you got to say about that?
Unfortunately, coming from the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, I'd say you've summarized the situation for us quite accurately, and thank you very much. But seriously, in Minneapolis, St. Paul is a very unique situation where I think, yeah, you literally drive 5 minutes and you're going to be in the other jurisdiction. So if there's any real differentiation, it can be really problematic, which is probably why there hasn't been real differentiation. But you need to look at how, what projects are available, market share. Minneapolis and St. Paul, you think they're the same jurisdiction. I mean, we're still down coming out of the Great Recession in 2000 in terms of hours worked. St. Paul is still down, and Minneapolis is basically fully recovered from their pre-2009 levels. So we're different than Minneapolis, and we can point to projects, we can point to how contractors operate differently between the two jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, the gravitational pull is gonna move you in that direction, whether you want to or not. You just gotta fight as hard as you can.
Can't fight the inevitable. Katie, what are we gonna do?
Well, so we do have a large project that is pulling manpower, and it's a real and it's a legitimate issue. But there are creative temporary solutions that should be looked at locally, that are separate of your contract, that are there to combat what that current issue is. And the contract and the wages and the language that is there that is more permanent needs to sustain your market for the people who don't want to travel and for the people who are traveling who will eventually come home to that market. And that needs to be looking at what is happening for you where you are.
Very good. Jason?
So I would say that I'll follow up and completely agree with Katie on the fact that these projects sometimes happen in the middle of a labor agreement where you don't have the opportunity to negotiate it. So you have to be creative and figure out ways that make sense to deal with it, with the problem at hand at that time. I've had this come up in negotiations numerous times for us, and I always go back to Katie's point that number one, your members and our employees, they want to sleep in their own bed and they don't want to travel. A majority of them would rather not go somewhere else and work. When that job is done, what's going to happen there? Same thing for us. If we raise these rates to a number that's not sustainable here, your members won't be working and my contractors won't have work to bid at that rate. But the other thing, being because I'm close proximity, I always go back to is we don't live there. We don't shop in the same stores they shop at. We don't go to the same type of restaurants that they go to. However, if you want, I am more than happy to talk to them about merging the locals. And that way it's one local, one wage rate, and we don't have to worry about portability anymore. But until that happens, that's not your local and not your concern.
Fair points. All right, Mike, how are we going to stop people from traveling?
I think, again, I keep going back and harping on the fact of preparation and education, and I keep going back to this, but when you go to the table, you have to have very candid conversations with the other side of the table. And one of the approaches that I've always taken, I dealt with the sister local having a lot of work and sucking the manpower out of her jurisdiction. So when you go to the table, you have to emphasize the fact of we are all stewards of the industry at the end of the day, and that's both sides of the table. It's all about sustainability, and it's not the symbiotic relationship. We really are truly partners. Whatever we do can impact labor. Labor, if they do something, can impact us. With that being said, I always emphasize the fact of win-win negotiations doesn't necessarily mean both sides are going to get what you want. So when I say that, you have to say, okay, yes, the other jurisdiction has a large project, but again, what is the overall 30,000 foot view of this? It's about sustainability. We want to have those jobs and those opportunities at home when our members want to, and employees, they want to stay at home, they don't want to travel. I would also emphasize on the side, or err on the side of caution to the newer chapter managers. When you have employers that pick up the jobs with the Amazons, the Facebooks, etc., you need to, again, emphasize the fact of, it's all about incentives. What you do today, again, it goes back to my point of being stewards of the industry. What you do today, i.e. per diem or incentives, yes, you're paying above scale, but just what will be the repercussions of that once his job leaves? Are you willing to make that $5 an hour commitment once his project leaves? Yeah, the customer may be picking up the tab now, but what are you doing to the local economy? You're setting false expectations to the other side of the table. So that's why I said you have to have this candid conversations with your business manager and the other side of the table. It's not about what's today. Yes, that additional money in the pocket is great, but I would much rather have a job or jobs available going forward once this job completes. So.
Very good point. Thank you. Chuck, you hear the argument all the time. How do you combat it?
I do, and it's hard to combat. It all comes down to talking about the industry in total and where are we going to be, what happens to our customers who have sustained us for all these years. We're just going to abandon them or tell them they have to pay so much money that they can't do the work. Jason, you've said several things during this session. I thought, boy, he's reading my mind, but I've always wanted to say to the other side when they start talking about the local next door got this big increase to, well, why don't we just merge the locals? Why don't we just have one local and we'll have one wage rate? We'll see how that works for the country. And sometimes you have to be that way, and that will back off some of them part of the way anyway. Well, no, we can't have the same rate, but we have to reflect what they're doing next door. But again, it's just about this ongoing discussion. If you're only bargaining the 90 days before the agreement is up, then you're not doing it right. You all have indicated that you are doing it the right way. There's a constant discussion of what's going on in the industry. And I think that's true. The best way to bargain your next agreement is start as soon as you sign your last agreement, because just like throwing new facts, new information on the table out of the blue gets a negative reaction from the union, waiting until 90 days before the agreement expires to begin to talk to them in a real way is going to not result in the best agreement for either side.
Very good. Jason, I see you, but I'm going to take a privilege as the moderator here and see if I can answer the question. I've been making you guys do all the answering, and I have yet to really add anything of value to this other than just pulling information out of you guys. But a very good way I've seen to tackle this problem is let's really dig into that settlement they got. Yeah, they got 4%, but where did they get it? Did it come from council or did they settle it locally? Okay, if they settled it locally, what is fully enveloped in that decision? Did they just get 4% on the wages, or was there favorable contract language in there or terms for the employers. Because I'd be willing to bet if you see an area give a decent wage increase and it didn't come from council, there was probably something in there for management as well. So if you want to talk those numbers, let's talk that language. That's the reason they got it, and I'd be happy to talk that with you. But I also want what the contractors there got as well. So to sum what I just set up there, it's understand the settlement that they're comparing to, because most times the local's only going to look at the wages they got. They're going to come to you and say, they got 4%. That's what we want. It's your job to call that area, to look into it, to find out what was in that 4%. What did they give, or what did they get, is better said, to warrant a 4% increase? Because 9 times out of 10, they probably got something, and it was probably worth it. So entertain it, but make sure you get something too. So that's the thought I had on that. Jason, my memory's terrible, but I thought I saw you raise your hand.
I just want to say, because I think it's important to say, every one of us have said in one way, shape, or form, and Mike gets to see this way more than we do because he deals with multiple chapters. The way you say something and how you present it really sets the tone and can determine the way that negotiations go. And I cannot stress enough for younger managers and people new to the industry, those lunches, meetings, and relationship building that you do with the business manager prior to negotiations pay dividends during negotiations.
I could not agree more with that. Very well said. Relationship it outweighs the whole point of this podcast. Data-driven negotiations. The data is meaningless if you have no relationship on the other side of the table. Unfortunately, at CIR, we see a lot of times where something could be settled if not for a strained relationship in an area. So that devalues everything. No reason to get data, guys. Go out there, build the relationship first. So podcast over. Like, we're not even going to talk data until you have a good relationship with your business managers. Saying that slightly in jest, but it does definitely pay dividends, like Jason said. Luke, we're going to get your comment and then we're going to wrap.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Ryan, but I'm going to do a little bit of devil's advocate here and just mostly to see Chuck Kelly's face when I say it. But if we bothered as a national organization to collect all of the data for every single settlement that's requested for CIR and plugged that into an algorithm on a computer, I think we'd be able to develop an algorithm that would pretty successfully predict and help people out in terms of where settlements are going to go going forward.
There was some mind reading going on a minute ago between Jason and Chuck, but Luke, I'm not sure if you can see my notepad over here, but you got to quit reading it, man. But yeah, there's some value to there being a central hub for that kind of data. How about we wrap this up? Thank you for being here. Thank you guys for taking time out of your day. You didn't have to. I know you're busy, but it's very appreciated. The information is very valuable. I believe that anybody that listens to this or watches this will get a lot out of the words you've said and the ideas that you've presented here today. I can't say it enough, but I'm going to say it one more time. Thank you very much. Chuck, thank you for doing this, for coming out of retirement and putting on that logo. That's nice. Good one, Mike. If you're just listening, you're going to have to come watch it for that one. But yes, thank you, Chuck, for lending us your knowledge once again and for being here. Have a wonderful Friday evening, afternoon, whatever it happens to be for you. We'll see you on the next podcast.